Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimberly Charrington, and on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS, I want to welcome you to today's HUSI seminar, Deterrence in the Balance, Arms Control, Modernization, and Strategic Resolve, and a special welcome to our featured guest, Michael Albertson. Don't miss next Friday's event as Dr. Christopher Ford speaks on Iran, deterrence, and the future of nonproliferation. Go to thinkdeterrence.com on our events page to learn more and register you and your colleagues for our upcoming events. During today's presentation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A at the top of the screen. And at any time, if you wish to address a question or show your support for it, you could put a little thumbs up in the chat box so that we can give that question priority. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our host for today's seminar, Mr. Peter Cusey himself, President and Senior Director of the Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and a Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and thank you to our audience for joining us today, including our President of NIDS, Dr. Jim Petrovsky, and also want to welcome our guest today, Mike Albertson. Mike has served for 16 years in the federal government, handling an extraordinary variety of mainly Russian-related defense issues. From 2018 to 2020, he was Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and in the office there also of Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. From 2015 to 2018, he was at the Department of State's Office of Strategic Stability and Deterrence Affairs. Prior to that, on the National Security Council from 2013 to 2014 as a director for Russia. And then from 2010 to 2012, he was a policy advisor to the Senior Advisor for Arms Control and Strategic Stability to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And there he participated in negotiation, ratification, and implementation of the New START Treaty. Now, prior to that, in the 6 years between 2004 and 2010, he was an intelligence analyst and then a senior intelligence analyst in the Department of Defense, studying Russian military capabilities and doctrine. We have asked him to come today to talk about not just arms control, but also strategic modernization and strategic stability, kind of the whole ball of wax, which he covers in his current position. Michael, thank you for coming. I know you're coming here from California, which means you got up at the crack of dawn. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that. But over to you, sir. And thank you again on behalf of NIDS. I want to thank you for taking the time to come talk to us again. And we look forward to your remarks. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you to you, Peter, for that kind introduction. And thank you to Kimberly and Jim for the invitation. It's a great honor. It's a great podcast. I've enjoyed following the conversation. It's good to see a lot of friends and former colleagues in the audience. Just a disclaimer, I'm speaking for myself. That way I can be open and frank with you about how I see the topic. Peter asked me to cover a lot of ground, and I really feel it's my job to do my best to try to add to the conversation that we're already having in this field. But I approach this with some degree of humility, and any criticisms I offer about sort of how we got to where we are equally self-criticisms, right? I've worked in this field for 2 decades. Just look at the state of it, so take what I say with as big a grain of salt as you would like. One of the topics I was asked to cover was the collapse of the traditional arms control frameworks. If the 1990s were the golden ages for arms control, and then 2000 were the silver ages, I guess some people would call this sort of the dark ages, where a lot of people see arms control as outdated, problematic, maybe even dangerous. So let's do a quick post-mortem on how we got to where we are. One, treaties aged out. They were not adapted, updated, or replaced, despite a lot of effort by the United States to do just that. And like any legal document, the longer an agreement goes on, the more likely there are to be problems. And the security environment changes, and you have to adapt accordingly to changes in the security environment. So things that made sense 10, 15, 20 years ago might not make sense today in terms of agreements, in terms of formats, in terms of ideas. And over the course of time, it's forgotten that, many of these treaties did amazing things. Treaties got rid of whole classes of missile systems that were deemed to be problematic. They moved or reduced thousands of tactical nuclear warheads in the European theater. They counted, eliminated huge numbers of conventional systems. They did amazing things, but a lot of them held on too long. They didn't get replaced, despite effort trying with the Russians. And in the end, the way things end tend to leave a bad taste in people's mouths about sort of formal treaty-based arms control and what it can do. The Russians are as difficult as always. They have seen little incentive, either positive or negative, to engage in a U.S. proposed arms control agenda, either proposed by Republicans or Democrats. I think here in the U.S., in our communities of interest, we all understand the lack of progress can squarely be placed on Russia and China for not engaging. But elsewhere in the world, Russia and China don't get a lot of blame for this. The U.S. gets the blame. The U.S. gets the pressure from this armament community for the state of the world. And in a lot of the world, including with our allies, the IQ on arms control has gone down. 10 years ago, when I was working the INF Treaty experience, the Russian violation of the INF Treaty, people had to be reminded about what the INF Treaty was. I was told by European allies that this was a U.S. problem and not their concern, which of course ignores a fair amount of history on INF. When we brought up the fact that Russia was violating the INF Treaty, we had to have a lot of rounds of talks with allies, with our closest allies, about what Russia was doing, trying to convince them that what we were saying was accurate. We had challenges or people bringing up, Iraq WMD as an analogy for what we were trying to tell them about Russia, because to them, this was one more problem with Russia when they didn't want Russia to be a problem. And they were worried about domestic pressures. They were worried about going back to 1979. To be fair, I think NATO recognizes this. There are people working hard at NATO on getting that community smart again on arms control. But there's a long way to go to get allies smart on this issue. People have tried alternatives to formal treaty-based arms control, thinking that this was lower hanger fruit, or this might be easier to get done. They've tried things like risk reduction, transparency, political agreements. None of those have gained a lot of traction with the Russians or the Chinese, so we haven't had a real momentum behind any alternative to formal treaty-based arms control. And there are a lot of ideas out there in the arms control space, some of which were floated just last week before the Putin-Trump Alaska summit, that don't really stand up to today's reality. People talk about, a moratorium on INF missiles, when Russia's been violating a treaty on INF missiles for 10 years. They talk about sort of reviving this idea from the end of the first Trump administration about a warhead freeze, a freeze on tactical warheads when the United States feels the need to sort of modernize its tactical nuclear forces. There's demands, that Russia stop building novel systems, demands that China come to the table. On some of these, sort of the ship has sailed. On others, I don't think we're not really sure what we want, and we aren't really prepared to pay the high price for some of the asks that we seem to be making in this space. Disarmament folks, I think, have sort of stood and watched this collapse. There's always been a tension historically between arms controllers and disarmers. This goes back to sort of, writings in the late 50s, early 60s. So don't put everyone in one basket. Rather than putting pressure on Russia and China, they focus attention on the U.S. and the West for not doing enough. They come up with treaties aimed at nuclear abolition that don't really have a practical pathway for implementation or verification. And they ignore sort of 50 years of experience in how to do this right, which is sort of a practical step-by-step approach that deals with real security realities. And this collapse, I think, has led to some narratives, right? Many of which are just modern recitations of old accusations, but something as someone proposing arms control agreements, you have to be sort of aware of the criticisms out there, and you have to be prepared to sort of take them head on and not dismiss them. These criticisms, one is that sort of arms control never works. It doesn't do any good. Again, you have to be able to cite examples to the contrary, that good things did happen, bad things that people predicted didn't happen, problems were avoided, and that sort of, the information, insights, and conversations we have with the other side were valuable. You have to sort of defend the track record of what arms control has done. Another sort of narrative out there is that sort of arms control does nothing but hold us back. You saw this with the ABM treaty. You saw this with the INF treaty. You see this with the New START treaty. again, I'd sort of post as a counterfactual, what have we done since we got out of the ABM treaty? What have we done since we got out of the INF treaty? We have limitations, and those limitations aren't necessarily arms control. We have real industrial based problems that we need to address. And getting out of arms control agreements introduces new risks that we didn't have before, and we just have to address them. There are also criticisms that sort of arms control doesn't tackle all of the problems, and it isn't fair when a treaty doesn't do everything that we think it should. We saw this with INF, where Russia has tactical nuclear weapons. Why doesn't New START address this? Russia's developing novel systems. Why doesn't New START address this? China's not involved. Why aren't they? Arms control does some things. It doesn't do other things. You just have to be aware there's areas of sort of cooperation, and then there's areas of sort of open competition. You have to be prepared to openly compete. And the last one, which probably is a longer conversation than I can have today, is sort of Russia cheats on everything and violates everything. And so why do anything with them? I think you just have to be really careful. And I say this as somebody who's worked on compliance issues and dealt with sort of the legal gray areas of any agreement. There are clear-cut violations, to be sure, right? Russia building a giant radar in the 80s that violated the ABM treaty, Russia producing a ground-launched cruise missile in violation of the INF treaty, what they're doing with the Conventional Weapons Convention, what they might be doing in outer space. There are some clear-cut violation type things that you have to think about. There are, however, other times when a violation is just an implementation problem that becomes a violation when it's not resolved, in the hopes that if you call something a violation, you highlight the seriousness and hope to unstick the issue from being just a concern. Look at Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, Open Skies, where we are in New START. These are implementation problems that became violations because the Russians simply got stubborn and wouldn't deal with the problem at hand. And then there's a whole bunch of gray space. And like in any legal document, it's like, is this a concern? Is it a violation? What do the lawyers say? And then there's just stuff that's actually not a violation, but people use the term violation. And if anyone ever says, this violates the spirit of an agreement, it probably means it's not really a violation, because if it was a violation, it would have been in the agreement, not just the spirit of the agreement. So arms control has become sort of this sort of whipping boy for why we can't get our own deterrence house in order, right? And I would just say it's not on arms control. It's on us for choosing different priorities for our time, money, attention, and for not taking care of our own business. I think there's this sort of warm, fuzzy blanket idea that if we were just sort of unconstrained, everything would work out fine. And I guess I would argue that in many areas we are not constrained. We have business that needs to be done. We all know what that business is, and we should take care of it. But attempting to say sort of unshackled, we will go back to sort of a peace through strength vision of the 1980s and simply duplicate it, ignores the real hard differences that we face vice what we had in the 1980s in terms of industrial base, in terms of sort of a bipartisan consensus to move out, in terms of sort of not having a negotiating partner in Moscow that we can deal with. It's a changed world, and I think we said, analogies can be made with the early 80s, but there are differences as well. So, we've been having these same kind of arguments, for the last 15 years, since New START was ratified, and nothing really has taken its place, and things have gotten worse. We've gotten, arms control is now something that's sort of fading from the scene. What it did is sort of largely taken for granted and probably is going to be forgotten pretty soon. We have some problems that are both emerged and emerging that we highlight in things like the two-peer report we did here at CGSR a few years ago. And we're now at the end of the New START Treaty. And you have this central debate, which you've seen in the podcast here that Peter and Kimberly have hosted about, New START, what comes next? What do we do in terms of limits? And numbers really in arms control are a fixation, and a lot of my writing over the last few years has been on this fixation and why it's not a helpful one to have in terms of solving the real problems we have and sort of the problems that arms control can fix. To me, and I highlight this to people, the main value of arms control in a treaty is not the limits, which gets the most attention, but sort of the bookkeeping, the accounting, the information, the transparency, the conversations. You know what the other side's doing. They know what you're doing. You can go see it. if you have concerns, and if you have problems, you're forcing the other side to talk about it. And a lot of this value gets sort of wiped aside by this, what's the right number for the new treaty? And it's really not a question that any of us in the outside expert community can answer. That's a sort of internal DoD homework assignment that they have to do based on our guidance and requirements. Sometimes the numbers discussion doesn't come up until midstream in a treaty negotiation. We can all do back of the envelope calculations. I'd point you to a recent podcast that Frank Miller did on some of these back of the calculations, since he's actually done the DoD homework inside the building. But I just caution, like, don't get hung up on a specific number right now, that it's 1,700 or 2,000 or 2,500 or something, because honestly, we don't know what the targeting requirements are behind the scenes, and that is going to dictate the numbers discussion. So I think what we really need to focus on in terms of arms control is, what do we think the problems are with Russia and China? Is arms control the right solution to those problems? What are we willing to give up to get what we want? And what kind of agreement do I need to construct to get there? And I think this is where the thinking in the community is really atrophied. I mean, we all got used to the purpose of arms control being, simply the numbers are going down. We all know the numbers are going down, and we're largely managing in a constructive way the process of going down. You weren't dealing cards back and forth of real value. You kind of knew where you wanted to go. You knew where you wanted to end up. It was just a question of sort of getting there. Now people have real demands from the Russians and the Chinese. They want sort of the moon and the stars from those countries, but they don't really know concretely what they want in terms of security concerns, and they aren't really willing to trade a whole lot of U.S. value to get them. I just take sort of tactical nuclear weapons as an example. Russia has a lot more. We didn't really care for a long time. Russia felt the need to get a lot of tactical nuclear weapons because they had a conventional force disparity, and all of a sudden, these things aren't a new start. They were a big issue. They have a lot and we don't. It's not fair. It gives them advantage because they're unconstrained. But what actually do people want in terms of Russian tactical nuclear weapons? People would say numerical reductions. They have a lot and we don't. Numerical reductions really don't solve your security problem, which is, Russia's willingness to use these things first to address, a failed conventional attack, or to use these things as sort of coercive leverage. It doesn't really matter if Russia has 2,000 or 500 or 200. You can spend a lot of time and energy reducing numbers, but not solve the real security problem you face. What do you want me to do if it isn't a reduction? Do you want me to move them further away from operational units? Do you want me to consolidate them in a couple places? Do you want me to ban them on certain platforms? We don't really get to this level of granularity in the discussion. And to do any of those things, you would have to pay a lot. And the Russian precondition that they've stated up front with technical weapons is basically the U.S. has to withdraw the technical weapons from Europe. So if you aren't willing to sort of pay that price or whittle that price down through a series of pretty detailed negotiations, it's kind of a MacGuffin. It's kind of a false lead. So formal arms control. Why do we do it? Why would we do it now? To me, it really has two purposes. One is, and other people have highlighted this in articles and podcasts, and we've highlighted in some analytical reports we've done, is one, dealing with the short-term problem of how does the U.S. respond to what China is doing in terms of its buildup. And I'd argue there's value to knowing what Russia is doing while we respond to what China is doing. And the other is dealing with this longer-term problem of managing a three-party nuclear issue, as we and China and Russia all go forward with modernization programs into, over the next decade in the late 2030s. To do the former, and this is a topic of big debate, what is the number do we stay at New START? I don't think 1550 is the right number to respond to the former problem. I guess my argument would be that, one, I don't think that New START limits are a stable equilibrium if the treaty's not in place, if the verification regime is not in place. This to me has parallels of sort of SALT II limits in the early 1980s, sort of a handshake agreement about abiding, sort of tends to break down because, each side's going to assume the other one is breaking the limits in an information vacuum, and that's just going to lead to problems. Second, it's been recognized by a lot of bipartisan things like the Strategic Posture Commission, and the Russians should understand this, that the U.S. has to make some adjustments on the strategic posture side and move beyond the limits of New START to stay consistent with our targeting policy. and deal with the growth in the Chinese ICBM silo force. You can't have sort of viable arms control in this environment if you're not letting, DoD, Joint Staff, Stratcom take care of the deterrence business. So it's just letting the consensus that's been agreed sort of go forward on the need to respond in some way. I think lastly, it's like the longer you place unreasonable demands on New START to account for emerged challenges, 15 years after it was signed, I think more you tarnish the successful legacy of what it did, which was, important in that it managed a complex Russian modernization cycle. And it was durable and important enough to last through a lot of problems in the bilateral relationship, really only getting derailed with a global pandemic and the biggest land war in Europe since 1945. It's like, just let it die a natural death, let it take credit for what it did and create something new to deal with, the current challenges that we face. There is this fear, right, that if there is no numerical anchor point, what will happen? And this is a perfectly understandable fear. I don't dismiss it. It's one we haven't faced for decades. There's also this sort of psychological factor that I think people need to recognize of numbers all of a sudden appearing to go up rather than down, which again, is perfectly understandable. This triggers sort of an emotional, psychological reaction. Here I'd say, and again, this is a topic that's come up, there are limitations involved, right? Like I remember as a kid going on road trips across the country to the West Coast, and you get to Montana and there were no posted speed limits. And so, the idea was, oh my goodness, you can drive as fast as you want because there is no speed limits. But you still have the limitations of how comfortable somebody feels going, the fact that you're driving a 10-year-old station wagon. It's not like you all of a sudden go 150 miles an hour because there is no speed limit. There are some challenges that are involved. And I think, just because there are no limits doesn't mean a buildup is going to be immediate, rapid, and super in terms of numbers. I think, the conversation that's being had is talking about conversions, maybe doing some uploading, but based on, the realities of defense industrial bases, hedges, stockpiles, things like that are realities. I think if you keep expectations manageable, you can build the outlines of a new formal arms control agreement with Russia around this new term problem. You can give it a 5-year duration with an option for, a 5-year extension. You can tell the Chinese they're more than welcome to join, and you can give yourself an exit clause in the agreement that if China gets beyond a certain point where we feel comfortable, you will withdraw from the treaty. Why does this, to me, sort of make sense in terms of a next step? First, I think you need to do something legally binding. To do all of the things you need to do that's durable enough to survive administration changes in the US and ups and downs with Russia. Like you have to have a legally binding forcing function to just exist. You have a strong verification framework from New START, data exchanges, inspections, notifications, etc. You have some markers that you need to address, including the new Russian nuclear arms strategic range systems. To me, it's pretty straightforward. You aren't going to ban them. You're probably just going to capture them in the limits, new definitions, new inspection procedures. You aren't discriminate them against in any sort of way. To me, that's doable. The Russians will put up a fuss. You have to negotiate that fuss away. The second is addressing Russian tactical nuclear warheads in line with sort of the NST resolution ratification. Here, the basis for what we have now is we have nothing. So anything better than nothing better addresses Russian tactical nuclear weapons. You can do this to me pretty easy. Data exchanges, maybe visits. You can, simply count cans that the Russians declare to contain a warhead, and same for us. Just going to a nuclear weapons storage site is more than we've ever done. You could also go more technically complex. Work's been done on this. That's been highlighted. You could try to go for a total warhead count, but I think this is where, as you get more and more complicated and you try to do more and more tactical nuclear warheads, things are going to get really complicated really fast. But I think you can do this pretty simply. You have broad political guidance, and then, the technical experts are going to go in and hash this out in the negotiations. Probably means, to get something on novel systems, to get something on total warheads or tactical warheads, probably the words missile defense are going to have to appear in this agreement. But it's up to you to negotiate that in a way that doesn't limit what the United States needs to do. Maybe they get to go to Fort Greely and pop open a clamshell door and look at an interceptor. Maybe we get to do the same with Moscow interceptors, but like maybe you have to give some briefings on Golden Dome. But you have to give the Russians something that checks the missile defense box that doesn't open you to criticism that we're limiting ourselves. The cap, you can set the cap wherever, DoD does its analysis. You can set it pretty high. You can not set a cap at all, because I would argue the value is sort of managing information exchange with the Russians as opposed to trying to, set a cap on sort of a question mark of where the Chinese are going on. Why does this provide value to us? If Russia says negotiate, let's negotiate, great. I think that's fine. We can start talking and see where it goes. If they say no, we can go about our deterrence business, I think, with a clear conscience. And the rest of the world asks, what are you doing in arms control? Why are you not doing arms control? You say, we have a concrete proposal. I'll show it to you. I'll send it to you. Here it is, very detailed. Moscow said no, but here's our proposal. We're trying to negotiate in good faith. Call Moscow and raise your concerns with them. Does this solve all of our problems? Does the proposal do that? Absolutely not. But it solves, I think, a real short-term problem, and it gets us at least prepared for dealing with the longer-term problem, and it allows us to sort of address our deterrence requirements over the long term. There are some other sort of big picture areas which I'd highlight, and we think very, very discreetly about sort of what the next proposals would be, like big picture stuff that we should also be thinking about. One is strategic stability. I think however you define it, sort of strategic stability is complex. It was complex in the Cold War. People ignore that now. It's more complex now, more multi-domain, more multipolar, but you're never going to solve for strategic stability. And you're also unlikely to achieve some, halcyon past moment of strategic stability, right? The 1990 agreement with the US and the Soviet Union on the topic, maybe, 2009, 2010, where there's Obama and Medvedev smiling and signing a New START treaty. You're not going to sort of solve the equation for strategic stability or have a world where there is no instability anymore. So, I guess I would make the following analogy with strategic stability for people who are not sort of arms control people who've read, 60 years of history. I look at it like I read a book a few years ago called The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi by an author named Boyce Upholt. And he was talking about sort of the Army Corps of Engineers and dealing with the Mississippi River. And the point was that sort of whatever you do along the river, it creates problems elsewhere. That it's a big, complicated force with a lot of water. And if you, build a dike here or you build a dam here, you divert the flow somewhere, it's going to lead to problems elsewhere. And all we're trying to do in sort of arms control is creating little solvable things here and there along a much greater river. And in doing so, you might channel instabilities into other directions, and you have to be aware of that. And also, if you create something, you have to go in and maintain it and keep it up. But there is always going to be instabilities in this equation with Russia and with China. And all you're really doing in deterrence, in arms control, is making a calculation of where you think it is more risky or less risky to do something. So all of these debates that we have in the field are about where we think it's best to take risks, and we should just be open about those calculations and assumptions. There is no, riskless, absolutely stabilizing option in the security environment. And that includes like not making choices on things. So one, I think we just need to be sort of open and real about strategic stability is like something we're just going to have to manage and channel and deal with, and that no arms control agreement or no weapon system is going to solve all the problems. It's going to be a very sort of holistic, emerging, evolving environment that we have to work together to solve. The second is, I think there's a need to build a new coalition on arms control. Arms control and deterrence have become sort of bifurcated, but I definitely see a middle sort of emerging, and I want to foster that middle. I want, there to be, a clear sort of majority in the middle who believes strongly in sort of taking care of deterrence business, but sort of sees value in doing arms control agreements and things that we think are solvable problems. What is that path to a viable, 70-30, Senate ratification vote? How do I have a coalition with allied and non-aligned states on U.S. arms control proposals? How do I, create this world? And I'm not going to, wave a wand and go back to the kinds of expert debates that we had in the 1980s. But I see this, starting to emerge in the conversations that we're having in the community. You see it in this podcast. I think you see it in the Strategic Stability podcast that, Vipin Narang and Pranay Vadi and Austin Long and MIT are doing. You see it in the findings of the Strategic Posture Commission. I mean, the problems are known. You have this two-peer problem. Resources are finite. Industrial capacity is finite. There's a place for practical arms control here. There's a way that people can see value in this. And it's just making arguments to different constituent camps that there's something in it for them to do agreements like this. To allow us to better understand Russia so we can focus on China, to avoid, costly worst case planning that's going to spend time, energy, and money in the nuclear space that you'd rather spend in building conventional weapons, to allow us to sort of manage and engage adversaries in the midst of competition elsewhere, and to allow us to get on with our strategic modernization program. It just has to be an arms control program grounded in reality. And I think the final thing I'll talk about is sort of the need to rebuild muscle memory in the field. We haven't had an active treaty negotiation for 15 years. I was 27 when we were negotiating New START. I just turned 43. You have a big missing middle class in arms control, just like in the deterrence field. Maybe half of those people are on the call right now. Senior experts who spend a lot of time and energy mentoring are leaving the field. You have a very motivated young cadre of next generation nuclear experts coming up, who lack practical experience sort of doing the work behind the scenes. If you want to do this work, you're going to need a big staff to do it. And it means you have to build a cadre of people. And the best way to build a cadre is to have a real negotiation that brings a lot of new talent and a lot of new thinking to the field. So I've put a lot of thought and energy into thinking about sort of new proposals, the problems we face, what those agreements might look like. It's been in some of my recent writings in the past few years, which people can find on the internet. Will the Russians play? That would be the criticism. Sort of none of this matters if the Russians don't engage. Maybe not. I think that is an open question to be seen. Russia might not want to engage. We might not want to engage with Russia, but Russia's going to face some real problems, no matter how the Ukraine issue is resolved, with their conventional forces, with their domestic industrial economy. They might see value in sort of stabilizing things with the U.S. in the nuclear space while they think about what they want to do with their next modernization cycle. Sort of never say never, right? There were a lot of bad takes in the early 1980s about sort of arms control's dead, it's never coming back. And then it did, because things changed. The geopolitical environment changed. So I'm just really happy to be having this conversation. We had an open question at a workshop a few years ago about sort of the coming arms control interregnum and whether this would be long or short. I think regardless of whether this is long or short, we need to prepare for a world both with and without arms control. And I've tried to do some of that thinking. I'd encourage other people to think about that as well. If you are in the arms control space, a maxim that a former boss of mine had was, you can't fight something with nothing in arms control. You have to have a concrete something you can point to. Otherwise, you're arguing about nothing, or you're arguing about the other side's proposal. So I'd encourage us, the United States, to develop an arms control proposal that makes sense for us, to make it specific, to make it consistent with what we feel our deterrence obligations are, and to put it out there, and see if the Russians and the Chinese engage. And if not, move on to other things. So I'll leave it at that, Peter. Happy to take questions from the audience, and again, very much appreciate the opportunity.
That was extraordinarily well done. I'm going to pay it to go read the transcript again, and because it's filled with really good thoughts. Now, I have a bunch of questions I've taken from the chat. Number one, what are the directions of the Chinese and Russian nuclear forces that most worry you that could be subject to arms control limits?
So The thing that probably worries me most about the Russians is not the novel systems, although I see them as sort of, I see them as sort of costly and unnecessary and sort of environmentally stupid and dangerous. So I don't see them as good, but I don't see them as the biggest problem we face. I think if Russia wants to spend a lot of time, energy, and money doing these magical missile defense wonder weapons, like let them do that. What I really worry about is big, heavy ICBMs, which Russia has always had a fixation about.
Yes.
And that was a problem that was identified long in the past, and it was dealt with in past arms control agreements, and it was tried to be tackled in things like START 2 and START 3. But that's what concerns me most is that Russia, once it gets its Sarmat program sort of up and running, or its Satan program, or whatever they happen to be calling the heavy ICBM, goes sort of big into that as their response to whatever they see us doing in missile defense. Like that is a lot of warheads on sort of a quick alert posture in silos, but they still see them as vulnerable. Like that is that direction. China, I think the biggest challenge is just sort of, it is unknown where they are going and where they will stop. I think if China were to come out tomorrow and say, we want to be at parity with the United States, that is our goal. Once we get to 1550 or 2000 or wherever, we will be comfortable. And that took away a lot of the unknowns in the equation. I think that would be stabilizing. But like how China chooses to build its force, I don't think is destabilizing. I think it's simply like the unknown of where China is going is the big question. And they see value in, I think, cultivating that unknown, or they themselves might not know in fact where they are going and where they will end up, because it's a dynamic thing over the next 10 years. But to me, it's not really the Chinese, are they doing ICBMs or SLBMs, and it's the unknowns in the equation.
Well, that gets right to the second question, which I was thinking of, is given the difficulty of having one ceiling for 3 countries, in which 2 countries you added up, it's got to be more than the third.
Right.
So if you don't have that, but you have the goal of transparency, assuming you can trust but verify,
right,
which goes along, you can't do without it. Would transparency as a initial step, again, assuming that you can verify, because you got to know where this stuff is to go look at it and say, yeah, okay, I'm comfortable with you've got X, whatever kind of systems. Is that something that's doable?
Yes. So I have been arguing for the last few years and sort of fleshing out this argument and getting some resistance and trying to figure out how to better my argument of, if you have problems with numbers, and you probably do have a problem with numbers in a three body problem, can you have an agreement where the purpose of the agreement is essentially to verify the accuracy of the declared data, but without limits? And again, this is the purpose of the verification regime in New START. Right. Any other formal agreement, it's verifying the accuracy of the declared data. So you don't have caps. Everyone's doing what they feel the need to do, but you have data exchanges, you have notifications, you have inspections, you have confidence that when you go to see something, because you largely know from national technical means and other sources what you're going to see when you go to see it, and then you're getting sort of confirmatory or not information from arms control, and you go take a look at things that you consider to be interesting or problematic, and then you're allowed to have sort of a formal conversation with the other side that they have to come to. That to me is sort of 95% of the problem. And sort of caps and what is the right number, I think then becomes this sort of distracting and perhaps unsolvable question that doesn't allow us to get the 95% of value that I want to get, which is just sort of, what are we doing in avoiding worst case analyses?
Here's a question that's come up in the chat. I'm just going to read it to you. Mm-hmm. How does arms control pan out with extended deterrence and desired levels of allied involvement in the West Pacific, East Asia, and in Europe?
I think this gets to this question of how deep do you really want to go on this tactical nuclear weapons question? Because, there has been a real identified need for some sort of change in U.S. extended deterrence posture, both in Europe and Asia, to address, what Russia has and what China's doing. And so the question is, the deeper you go into the tactical nuclear weapons problem, the more allies are going to be concerned, the more they're going to want to be involved, and the more they're going to have to play, probably in some sort of inspection and verification regime if you're basing things outside the United States. So, to me, the goal is to find, I think, something simple and useful that checks the box on tactical nuclear weapons that gives you more than you have now. But I fear what often happens is that people say, I will solve 100% for the tactical nuclear weapons problem. And I think just given how big tactical nuclear weapons are, how they can be taken apart and put back together and be in bits and pieces and in storage sites and abroad, it is a really, really messy problem the further you go into the technical world. And it's not that we shouldn't think about the technical problem and that be the long-term perhaps solution, but in terms of getting into the pool on tactical nuclear weapons, I would start wading into the shallow end as opposed to jumping into the deep end, where, again, you run into a lot of complications with allies.
Okay. Couple other questions here. I'm going to give you two and you can answer them both, and then we'll go on. What kind of risk reduction measures do you think the Chinese would be open to right now, number one? And number two, I had mentioned this to Rose when she spoke at one of our recent meetings, and that is go to India and Pakistan and make a deal between those two. And try it first with them, given the fact they both have extended deterrent mentors to some degree. Now, I mean, we're an ally with Pakistan, but we'd like to be allies with India. On the other hand, Russia was a long-term ally of India, and China was, of course, built the Khan network, which I want to get to later. But those two issues, what the risk reduction measures with respect to China, and in the absence of that, could you go and do an arms control deal between India and Pakistan, for example?
Yes. So on the China piece, and I'm writing a paper on this now, I'm just skeptical that sort of risk reduction, like the term risk reduction, is a useful organizing concept to do business with the Chinese. Simply because I think the Chinese see value in creating risks for the United States. And so reducing risks is not really something that they're interested in doing.
No, they're in the business of doing the opposite.
Because they're kind of in the business of doing the opposite, and it's useful for us to try to reduce risk because we don't want them to change the status quo. It's useful for them to create risks in an effort to change the status quo. Where there's sort of useful conversations to be had if it's not about risk reduction and they probably aren't getting involved in arms control, I think it is, pushing back on the Chinese notion that escalation can be managed, that there is sort of a clear path to victory in the Indo-Pacific, which then would lead you to conversations about, war termination, de-escalation, off-ramps in like very messy nuclear situations. So having those kinds of conversations with the Chinese, presenting them with, you probably aren't going to have this unfold the way you think it's going to unfold, which is going to lead to some really hard, messy nuclear issues, of which the United States has some experience, but like you and I, China, need to talk about those. Otherwise, I think really you are waiting for China to engage in this, and you're waiting for them based on their own calculations to decide it's in my interest to get in this because I don't like the way the world is going when I'm not.
Right.
On India, Pakistan, I think having just become sort of involved in India, Pakistan stuff over the last couple of years, because I have a colleague, Zachary Davis, who's one of the experts in this field, it is really, really interesting. And for people who want to get into the nuclear space, India, Pakistan is one of the most fascinating things you can study in terms of the nuclear space, both in terms of like the dangers involved in what those two sides are doing, but also the strange sort of modus operandi they have between the two of them, where like they somehow figure it out.
Yeah. When I
in
worked
these.
at the United Nations, I had in the Office of Energy and Environment at the UN Environment Program, the big boss was a nuclear physicist from Pakistan. The little boss was a nuclear physicist from India. And their dynamic was extraordinary because one of them had been kicked out of Pakistan saying he opposed the development of the nuclear bomb. And they said, here's your choice. We'll put you in prison or we'll give you a cushy job in the UN where you be quiet. So, but it was, I was going to say good luck with India and Pakistan, but it's manageable. You both got about 100 warheads. They're right there, and they have an incentive to make sure nobody goes first,
Right.
or second. That they never use these things because who knows? I apologize for interrupting you, but it is an extraordinary, I think, an opportunity, given they recently had thank God it didn't escalate out of control. I'm sorry about that, but continue.
No, I mean, I think it's worthy of a lot of interesting study. I think it's, if you can't get the Brits and the French involved and have like a real P5 discussion of, collective nuclear action, India, Pakistan is a really interesting thing to put some intellectual capital on, whether they want to deal with each other or not. But understanding this problem of like what an unconstrained world looks like, where like you have hotlines, but do you use the hotlines or not? And all of those interesting dynamics that take place in India and Pakistan are sort, I think, worthy of attention, worthy of some study, and worthy of drawing some conclusions on, and worthy of proposing some solutions, whether they end up paying for it or not. It's a cool thing to look at if you're a nuclear policy expert.
I want to go back to the theater systems. In 1999, Mr. Yeltsin said, develop battlefield nuclear warheads that are small, very accurate, low yield, but I can use in the battlefield. And that was April 1999. Putin has made, and his colleagues have made somewhere in the vicinity of 40 or to 45 explicit nuclear threats to use theater weapons in the Ukraine theater, unless if the United States did, gave Ukraine the wrong kind of weapons or Ukraine hit the wrong kind of targets. My question to you is, and there's a division in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Is it bluff or is this real? Because those who don't want to escalate have said it's real. And those who said, give Ukraine what they need to quote unquote win, however you want to define it, is they think it's largely bluff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know how you prove it because it's in Putin's mind, but see what you can do with that.
Right. No, that is a good big hard question. And getting back to this sort of strategic stability question, I mean, the Russians they're both very specific about this and they're very ambiguous about this. So they can sort of play it both ways. In terms of specificity, I get concerned when I see, real things being approached that fit sort of general staff criteria for when we would use battlefield nuclear weapons, right? Where there's conventional collapse on the battlefield, where I've lost control of a front, where there is, one particular strategic target that if I hit would change the course of a conventional conflict on the ground, things like that, where at certain points in time in the Ukraine situation, you did see the Russian military approaching those conditions. And that then becomes this sort of catch-22 of, it's like, when you've won conventionally, that's when the nuclear danger is the highest, and you have to deal with it. Then there, however, is all of this sort of deliberately created political ambiguity about, when the Russian state is threatened, the existence of the Russian state is threatened, like, tactical nuclear weapons are on the table, or when something of strategic value in Russia has been hit, it's nuclear weapons are a viable response. And that's where you see a lot of the threats come in. And we've had conversations in the Track 2 world with Russian nuclear interlocutors who basically have grown frustrated over the Ukraine crisis of, why aren't you taking our nuclear threat seriously? And the answer is sort of, you make so many of them, and they come from so many different Russian officials, and you never actually follow through on any of them, thank goodness, that it's really hard to sort of separate the signal from the noise on your nuclear, threats, because you throw it around so casually. And I think this is one of the big debates that's going to take place in Russia sort of post-Ukraine, is Russia, spent a lot of time and energy developing all these tactical nuclear weapon systems. Were they actually effective or not in deterring the West? And I think there's going to be pros and cons to that debate. But they spent a lot of energy and time and money on these things that they didn't use and may or may not have actually deterred us from supplying the Ukrainians with lots of military systems. So I think it then sort of going forward, it'll be interesting how the nuclear debate goes in Russia and how they choose to prioritize maybe more tactical nuclear weapon systems, or they say, actually, what we need is a lot more air defense, a lot more conventional strike, a lot more, of those kind of things. But is a really big open debate that I think you're going to see unfold over the next couple of years.
Would it be fair to say that to some degree the United States took our deterrent off the table by saying we don't want to risk escalation?
I mean, I think it gets to this question of there is sometimes value in being ambiguous. Like, we, the United States, we tend to see value in being transparent and open and clear, when our adversaries see value in being sort of unclear and raising uncertainties and fears and risks in the mind of our opponent. And, and the criticism is always like, we have to be clear or else it's destabilizing. And sometimes I would argue like it's stabilizing to make the Russians think, that we could do things. Because, actually our best ally is the Russian analysis of what they think we can do, because they think we can do everything. And so when you categorically rule out, we're going to go here, we're going to do this, we're going to do those things, it makes them more comfortable and more confident sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I think was the problem. There are two related questions here. What are incentives that we could put on the table that would bring Russia or China to the arms control table, number one? And number two, instead of having an overall number, what about ceilings on specific weapon types? Now, I had suggested to Rose Scott-Miller, that we put a ceiling on large MIRVed ICBMs, which you mentioned earlier. And she tended to think that ship has sailed, though that's the thing we worry about in terms of preemption.
Yep.
More than anything, as opposed to using theater nuclear weapons first, which isn't a numbers game. It's just if any number is used. And that's the escalate to win problem we have. So is it worth pursuing ceilings on specific types, and or what incentives are available, do you think, to get these two adversaries to the table, assuming what you want them to do at the table is a good objective? I'm assuming that we're just not going to have them to come to the table for nothing, but if there's something we really need, like transparency agreement or something.
So I looked at both these topics a couple of years ago in a paper I wrote called "Closing the Gap," where I was thinking about how do you do concrete arms control stuff going forward. In terms of incentives for getting the Russians and the Chinese table, I think you have to say that you are willing to at least discuss Russian and Chinese concerns that they bring to the table. So you have a concrete proposal of what you want to talk about, and you don't immediately rule out talking about things that the Russians and the Chinese will bring to the table. I think by saying, like, we're not going to talk about missile defense, like, what incentive do the Russians and the Chinese have to come and talk to you? Mm-hmm. And my experience with this is sort of New START in missile defense, where the Russians obviously had a precondition that, like, the words missile defense must appear somewhere in the treaty. Everyone was very worried about it. But the negotiating team managed to negotiate essentially something very meaningless into the treaty that allowed the Russians to check the box and didn't constrain us in any way on missile defense. And again, this is the goal of any good negotiator: is you put something like that on the table. The Russians and the Chinese are going to have a very maximalist demand. They're going to stick to it for a long time, and you have to try to whittle that down over the course of a negotiation to something that you can live with. But by just saying we're not going to talk about it, you're sort of removing the incentive they have to negotiate. This question about sublimits, you can make things more complicated. You can say freedom to mix, do what you want. You can do sublimits. If the sublimits are actually limiting, right? If you are actually sort of preventing one side from doing what it wants to do, there's going to be some cost involved. And you just have to be aware of that and say, it is of value to me to cap Russian heavy ICBMs. They might put limits on bombers or something like that, right? Like that is going to be the cost that they put on the table that you might pay or not pay depending on how valuable a sublimit is. Or you can create sort of a sublimit without meaning, but just sort of caps, you can have 10 Poseidons, or you can have 200, B-21s or something like that. It doesn't really limit the program of record or something like that on either side, but you're sort of capping something that you kind of see as value to prevent sort of a breakout. So, again, I think this gets to this point I was raising about sublimits involve sort of knowing what you want and what you think is of real security importance, and we haven't done a whole lot of that thinking, but I think going into an agreement, we should do a fair amount of thinking on that sort of question and whether sublimits are applicable.
Well, we are now at 10:57. This has been an extraordinary conversation, Michael. You've done a great job. I'm going to turn it back to my president, Jim Petrovsky, who's head of the National Institute of Deterrence Studies. And Jim, if you have any questions you'd like to follow up with or any comments you'd like to make, and then I'll have Mike finish by giving us kind of a 1 to 2 minute summary of what he hopes people have gotten as a message for today.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And again, thank you, Michael. Yeah, by the way, I find you have a very good quality speaking voice. So you do well in this forum. So I just wanted to pass that on. But I did have a question for you that probably will sort of help you to summarize this. And that is something I tended to lean into in a show prep. And that is, what do you see, or how do you define the ultimate goal of a nuclear arms treaty, or maybe even the intermediate goals? Because that's, everything's got to have a goal, and I've never really been able to wrap my head around it. So I'll pass that on to you, and you can use that as your closer if you want to. And just wanted to say thank you to our audience. Of course, you make us happen. Go ahead.
Well, Jim, very, very, very kind of you. My dad was a college professor, so I spent time watching him do Greek and Roman art history lessons, and I was like, if he can make that interesting, maybe I can make arms control interesting, and that's a hard thing to do. So the goal, I guess, if I had one word, what is the goal of arms control? It's not reductions, it's not limitations, it's management. I look at this as sort of a management problem for 5 years and 10 years, where there's a lot of uncertainties. There's going to be a lot of sort of worst case analyses done that might end up being sort of costly cul-de-sacs to go down. And the more information I have, and I would think the same cases for the Russians and the Chinese, sort of the information you have on what the other side's doing avoids these kind of worst case spending exercises that don't actually provide you any security value. And I'm just trying to sort of manage the next modernization cycle between now 3 countries. And again, it might be the case where everyone says, let's just compete for the next 10 years and see where we are. But I think where that is going to end you up is we're going to be in 2035, and the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans are going to be where we are. And everyone's going to say, are we actually more secure now than we were 10 years ago? And the answer will be, yeah, probably not. We still have a lot of concerns. We still have a lot of issues. And everyone will say, didn't there used to be this thing called arms control that we did in the past? And maybe we should go back to it. And at that point, there won't be anybody left who remembers how to do arms control, and we'll sort of be going back to,
That's true.
1959 and like finding all of the files and remembering like how we did the talks back then. And so to try to avoid that, I'm like, can't we do something sort of reasonable to sort of manage things while we still all largely sort of go about our business, but do it in a way that avoids sort of the bigger pitfalls I could see.
With that, Michael, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We invite everybody to hear another, I'm sure, wonderful presentation with Ambassador Chris Ford, who is just an extraordinary analyst and thinker, who's going to talk to us about Iran and proliferation and the non-proliferation treaty and what the prospects are there. Jen, I want to thank also Kimberly, who does wonderful work organizing and doing logistics here. And thank you to NIDS for sponsoring this. And to you, Michael, my best to you. And also, would you give my friend Brad Roberts, who is your boss, who does such wonderful work out there in California. I want to thank you. And again, we will have you back probably early next year. We'll have to figure that out. But again, thank you for wonderful remarks. And Kimberly will have a transcript and the video for you probably sometime later today or fairly soon. And again, thank you to all our participants, our sponsors, some of whom are online right now. Thank you again for your support. And again, Michael, thank you. You did a great job. Thanks.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Thanks everyone for taking the time out of your morning to listen to me and stay in touch. I'm openly findable. So if people have follow-on questions or want to engage more, I'm out there.
Okay.